gentle listener, and welcome to Nocturnal Transmissions. Many moons ago, way back in the year 2019 as a matter of fact, we received a suggestion for a story to feature on the podcast. This suggestion came from Thomas, who evidently believed that the Nocturnal Transmissions faithful would be receptive to a relentless onslaught of wretchedness, despair, and revulsion, chronicling the eve of a vile, unthinkable, Lovecraftian Armageddon. Well, I had my doubts. So I have attempted to inoculate you, as it were, over the course of a year with horrors and shocks that might best prepare you for this abject tale of creeping havoc. Now, thanks to the careful preparation to which you have been unwittingly subjected, gentle listener, I do believe you are ready. Nocturnal Transmissions is proud to present Tim Curran's Scratching from the Outer Darkness. After 2 weeks of relative silence in which the pot of the world began to boil over, Simone Petrou heard the scratching again. This time it came from within the walls. Sometimes it came from the shadows, particularly the shadows in the corners, and sometimes from behind her or the sky overhead, and sometimes from inside people. "You have a marked hyperoral sensitivity," Dr. Wells explained to her. "A form of hyperacusis. It's not unusual with those without sight. When one sense fails, others are heightened." "But it's beyond that," Simone told him with a singular note of desperation. "I hear strange things. Things I should not hear." "What sort of things?" She swallowed. "Sounds. Things echoing from another place. Busy sounds." He told her that auditory hallucinations were known as paracusia. Sometimes they were signs of a very serious medical condition. He did not use the word schizophrenia, but she was certain he was thinking it. "Just because you hear things others do not does not necessarily mean there's anything there," he explained. "And it doesn't mean anything isn't either," she told him. "Rocky hears it too. How do you explain that?" But he couldn't, of course. Dr. Wells was a good man, she thought, but this was beyond him. Ever since she was a child, she heard things others could not. It ran in the family. It was something of a Petrou family curse, like the blindness, the ability to detect sounds in a frequency beyond that of ordinary human hearing. Simone had been blind since birth. Vision was an abstract concept to her. She could no more describe her acute hearing to Dr. Wells than he could describe sight to her. Stalemate. Of course, it really didn't matter. Things had gone far beyond that point now. Feeling very alone and very vulnerable, she listened for it to start again because she knew it would. There had been the 2-week reprieve, of course, but now the scratching was coming again, and it was more frenzied and determined than ever. Like someone's trying to get through, she thought. trying to dig their way through a stone wall. Scritch, scritch, scrape, scrape. That was the sound she kept hearing. It was worse at night. It was always worse at night. Listen. Yes, there it was again. Scritch, scritch. Rocky started to howl. Oh yes, he could hear it, and he knew it was bad. Whatever was behind it, it was bad. "Come here, boy," she said, but he would not. She found him over by the wall, fixated on the sounds coming from the corner. She petted him, tried to hug him, but he would have none of it. Beneath his fur he was a rigid mass of bunched cables. "It's okay, my big boy, it'll be okay," she said. But he knew better. And so did she. The scratching sounded like an animal digging, claws scraping against a door, the sound of tunneling, determined tunneling. She cried out involuntarily. She couldn't bear it any more. Her greatest fear was that whatever was doing it might get through. Get through from where? But she didn't know. She just didn't know. Night, another abstract concept to the sightless, was a time she had always enjoyed the most. The noise of the city diminished, and she could really hear the world. The gurgling of pipes in the ceiling, the gentle breeze playing at the eaves, bats squeaking as they chased bugs around streetlights, Mr. Astano rocking in his chair on the third floor, the young couple, Jenna and Josh Ryan, at the end of the corridor, making love, trying to be quiet because their bed was so terribly creaky. Through the furnace duct she always heard them giggling in their intimacy. But that had changed now, hadn't it? Yes, everything had changed. These past few weeks the night breeze was contaminated by a sweet, evil stench like nothing she had ever smelled before. Mr. Astano no longer rocked in his chair. Now he sobbed through the dark watches of the night. For 3 nights running she had heard whippoorwills shrilling in the park, growing louder and louder in a diabolic chorus. Rocky howled and whined, sniffing around the baseboards almost constantly, and the Ryans, they no longer made love or giggled. Now they whispered in low, secretive voices, reading gibberish to one another out of books. Last night Simone had clearly heard Josh Ryan's voice echoing through the furnace duct. "There are names one must not pronounce, and those that should never be called." The scratching was persistently loud tonight, and no one could ever convince her it was hallucinatory. It came from outside, not within. Her nerves frayed, a frost lying over her skin that made her shiver uncontrollably. Simone turned on the TV. She turned it on, loud. The voices on CNN were initially comforting, but soon enough, disturbing. There had been a mass suicide in Central Park. By starlight, 2,000 gatherers had, according to witnesses, simultaneously slit their left wrists, using the gushing blood to paint an odd symbol on their foreheads, something like a stem with 5 branches. The police were saying they were members of a fringe religious sect known as the Church of Starry Wisdom. In Scotland, there had been arrests of a group, the Chorazos cult, in Caithness, who had gathered on the bleak moorland at a prehistoric megalithic site known as the Hill of Broken Stones. Apparently, they had ritually sacrificed several children, offering them to a pagan god known as the Lord of Many Skins. In Africa, there were numerous atrocities committed, the most appalling of which seemed to be that hundreds of people had congregated at a place known as the Mountain of the Black Wind in Kenya, and cut their own tongues out, so that they would not, in their religious ecstasy, speak the forbidden name of their holy avatar. There were rumors that the offered tongues were then boiled and eaten in some execrable rite known as the Festival of the Flies, which dated from antiquity. Madness, she thought. Madness on every front. Christians called it Armageddon, and began feverishly quoting from the Book of Revelation as all across North America and Europe they flung themselves off the tallest buildings they could find, smashing to pulp far below, so that the Lord could wash his feet in the blood of the faithful as he walked the streets of men during the second coming. It was falling apart. It was all falling apart now. There was mass insanity, religious frenzy, mob violence, murder, and genocide coming from every corner of the world. Simone finally shut the TV off. The world was unraveling, but there seemed to be no root cause, at least none a sane mind would even consider. The whippoorwills resumed their eerie rhythmic piping in the park, growing louder and louder, their cries coming faster and more strident as if they were possessed of some rising mania. Rocky began to whine in a pathetic, puppy-like tone. At the windows, Simone heard what sounded like hundreds of insects buzzing. It all seemed to be building towards something, and she was more afraid than she had ever been in her life. Now there were screams out in the street, hysterical and rising, becoming something like dozens of cackling voices, reaching an almost hypersonic crescendo of sheer dementia. They resonated through her, riding her bones and making her nerve endings ring out. There was a power to them, some nameless, menacing cabalism that filled her head with alien thoughts and impulses. Now, the walls. Oh, dear God, the walls were vibrating, keeping time with the voices and the whippoorwills. Not out in the streets, not out in the streets, but from within the walls. Yes, echoing voices from some terribly distant place, and as she listened, she could not be certain they were of human origin. Guttural choking, discordant shrieking, bleatings and hissings and vile trumpeting, and reverberating lunatic chanting, hollow noises as of storm winds rushing through subterranean channels. Dear God, what did it mean? What did any of it mean? There was a sour taste on her tongue and a foul stench of graveyards. Feeling dizzy and weak, her stomach bubbling with a cold, nauseous jelly, Simone fell to the floor, cupping her hands over her ears as the blood rushed and roared in her head, making it feel as if her brain was boiling in her skull. The sounds were getting louder and louder, the floorboards shuddering, the room seeming to quiver and quake like pudding. There were smacking and slurping sounds, the cries of humans and animals, of things that were neither. All of it lorded over now by a cacophonous buzzing that made her bones rattle and her teeth chatter. It sounded like some monstrous insect descending from the sky on droning, membranous wings. Then it stopped. All of it ended simultaneously, and there was only a great unearthly silence, broken by her own gasping and Rocky's whimpering. Other than that, nothing. Nothing at all. A voice in Simone's head said, "It was close that time. Very, very close. They almost got through. The barrier between here and there is wearing very thin." But she had no idea what any of it meant. Between here and where? "Stop it! Stop it!" she told herself. "You're losing your mind." She pulled herself up from the floor, barely able to maintain her balance. The silence was immense. It was a great, soundless black vacuum of the sort she always imagined existed beyond the rim of the universe. She made it to the sofa and collapsed on it, wiping a dew of sweat from her face. With a trembling hand, she turned the TV on because she needed to hear voices, music, anything to break that wall of morbid silence. On CNN there were voices, yes, but they spoke of the most awful things, things that only amplified her psychosis. Because it must have been psychosis. She couldn't be hearing these things, these awful sounds, like the veneer of reality was ripping open. It was reported that several million people had made a pilgrimage to Calcutta to await the appearance of a dark-skinned prophet at the Temple of the Long Shadow, whom they referred to simply as the Messenger. Border skirmishes had broken out in Asia and the Middle East. There was pestilence in Indochina, bloodshed on the Gaza Strip, immense swarms of locusts blackening the skies over Ethiopia, and the Iranians had fully admitted that they were in possession of several dozen hydrogen bombs, each of which were equivalent to 50 million tons of TNT. With them, they would soon ascend to heaven in the black arms of destiny, via a synchronized nuclear detonation which would bring about what they referred to as the symbolic Eye of Azathoth. In Eastern Europe, a terror organization calling itself either the Black Brotherhood or the Al-Shagog Brigade had been burning Christian churches, Jewish synagogues, and Muslim mosques, calling them places of utter blasphemy which must be eradicated so that the way may be purified before the King could descend from the dark star and the Great Father rise from his sunken tomb. "Kooks, Rocky," Simone said. "This world is full of kooks." The idea made her smile thinly. Was it at all possible that the human race was losing its collective mind at the same time? That instead of sporadic outbreaks of insanity, there was a global lunacy at work here? She told herself it was highly unlikely, but she didn't believe herself. That afternoon, the UPS man came to her door, knocking gently, announcing that he carried a parcel that had to be signed for. It was perfectly innocuous. He was delivering her new laptop with screen reader software. Yet, as she made to open the door, a sense of fright and loathing swept through her, as if what was out there was something hideous, beyond imagining. But she did open the door, and right away she was gripped by a manic paranoia and a mounting claustrophobia. "Package for you," the man said, his voice cheerful enough, but it was a facade, an awful facade. For there was something sinister and lurking just beneath his skin, and she knew if she reached out to touch his face, it would be pebbly like the flesh of a toad. Right away she heard that dire scratching coming from inside him, like rats pawing and chewing. In her mind she sensed a spiraling, limitless abyss waiting to open like a black funnel. A voice, his own, but ragged and wizened, whispered in her skull.
Has she linked? Have the uncles shown her the grey void? Has she seen the black man with the horn?
The voice kept echoing in her head until she felt a cool, sour sweat run down her face. "Are you okay, Mum?" asked the UPS man. "Yes," she breathed, taking the parcel from him with strained, shaking fingers. "Yes, fine." "Okay, if you're sure." But deep within her, perhaps at some subconscious level of atavistic fright, she could sense a godless vortexual darkness opening up inside him, and a noxious stench like seared porcine flesh blew into her face, and that dry, windy voice whispered once again.
Show her. It has been promised in the Gol Nigral as such. Let her gaze into the moon lens and gape upon the black goat of the forest with 1,000 squirming young. Let her find communion with the writhing dark on the other side.
"Listen, are you sure you're all right?"
"Yes.
Please, I'm fine." But she was not fine. She was blind and alone, and a ravening outer darkness was spilling from this man in diseased rivers of slime. She felt scalding winds and dust blowing in her face, a fetid odour enveloping her that was no single stench, but dozens breathing hot in her face with a fungus, gangrenous, nearly palpable odour. He reached out to steady her, clutching her wrist with a flabby, leprous claw. She screamed. She could not help herself. She slammed the door in his face, ignoring the whining and growling of Rocky. Physical waves of disgust and utter repulsion nearly paralyzed her, but she managed to reach the toilet as the vomit came out of her in a frothing expulsion. And crouching there on the bathroom floor, shuddering, drooling, her mouth wide in a silent scream, she could still hear that voice whispering from unknown gulfs.
Even now at the threshold, the veneer of the great white space weakens as the time of the pushing and the birthing draws near.
Enough! By God, it was enough! She went into the kitchen and made sure Rocky had enough food and water. He had touched neither all day. He was hiding under the kitchen table, trembling. When she reached out to comfort him, he snapped at her. "My dog. Even my dog." Feeling depressed and defenseless, and without a friend in the world, Simone climbed into bed and tried to sleep. After a desperate round of tossing and turning, she did just that. her dreams began right away. Twisted, unreal phantasms of limitless spaces closing in on her, immense and shaggy forms brushing against her, monstrous, pulpous, undimensioned things moving past her, crawling up winding staircases that led into nothingness, and being hunted through shattered thoroughfares of wriggling weeds and monolithic towers that felt like smooth, hot glass under her fingertips, and a world, an anti-world of shifting surface angles where everything was soft and slimy to the touch, like the spongy, mucid tissue of a corpse. And through it all, she heard a voice. A booming and commanding voice, asking her to make communion with the beautiful, cunning darkness that awaits us all in the end. A sinister, malign sort of melody was ever playing in the background, at first soft and silky, then building to a harsh, feverish pitch, an immense, ear-splitting, dissonant noise of bat-like squeaking and shrill creaking, bone grinding against bone, thunderous booming, saw blades biting into steel plate, chainsaws whirring, and jagged-toothed files scraping over the strings of violins and cellos, all of it combining, creating a deranged, jarring cacophony of disharmonic noise, filling her head, melting her nerves like hot wires, cracking open her skull like an eggshell until she came awake screaming in the deathly silence of her bedroom. Soaked with sweat, shaking like a wet dog, she forced herself to calm down. She was awake, and she knew she was awake, but the terror and anxiety bunched in her chest did not lessen. It constricted tighter. Her brain was sending a steady current of electricity to her nerves, and the result was that her entire body was jittery and trembling. She had the most awful sense that she was not alone in the room, that another stood by her, breathing. She could hear a low, rasping respiration, a coarse, vulgar sort of sound like that a beast would make. "Rocky," she said in a weak, barely existent voice. "Rocky?" Her voice reverberated around her oddly. The sound waves it created seemed to make the air around her vibrate. Her words bounced off the walls and came back at her like ripples she could feel on her skin. She could still hear the breathing. Terrified, she swung her legs out of bed and stood, instantly recoiling because the floor was not the floor, but something almost gelatinous. A cool, burning mud that was crawling with squirming things that began to slink up her legs. Dreaming, you're still dreaming." But she couldn't convince herself of that. She reached out for the bed, but it was no longer there. Panting, she stumbled towards the door and felt an immense momentary relief when it was still there. Something had happened. A pipe had burst or something, and she was wading through shit. Yet there was no odor, save a dank, subterraneous smell. She was in the short hallway that led into the living room. She pushed on through the slopping ooze. She reached out and could find no walls. The hallway seemed to have no end and no beginning. "Rocky!" she screamed in desperation. Again her words bounced around, becoming waves crashing ashore on an alien beach and striking her with force in their reverberations. The air, warm, thick, almost congested, trembled like jelly. She kept moving, reaching out in every direction, but there was nothing, absolutely nothing to touch. That awful, degenerate breathing kept pace with her, but its owner made no sound as it glided along with her. Her head was throbbing, her temples pumping. A headache was gathering steam, its pain funneling out from the back of her brain to some excruciating white-hot spot in her forehead. There was an explosion of brilliance in her mind that left her reeling. It blazed like white phosphorus, igniting her thoughts in a firestorm of luminosity.
What? What is this?
Being blind since birth, she did not know sight. She could not conceptualize it. It was perfectly abstract in all ways to her. Even her dreams were of sounds, smells, tactile sensations. But not this. She saw, for the first time in her life, a multitude of colors and images and forms, like thousands of bright fireflies filling the night sky. And then she saw, if only for the briefest of moments, what stood breathing behind her. A man, a very tall man, in a tattered cloak that crept with leggy vermin. He was staring down at her. His face was black, not African, but something like smooth, shiny onyx. A living, carved mask. 2 brilliant yellow eyes, huge and glossy like egg yolks, watched her. And then it was gone. Whatever had opened in her head had closed, and she nearly passed out. The dark man gripped her with fingers like crawling roots, and she let out a scream, one that seemed to echo from a distant room. Her hands, unbidden, reached out to him as they had done so many times in her life, finding a face that was greasy and soft like a gently pulsating mushroom. She cringed, but her fingers continued exploring, despite the abhorrence that made her viscera hang in warm, pale loops. Beneath her fingertips nodules rose, and from each something worming slinked free. They crawled over the backs of her hands. One of them licked at a cut on her pinky, another suckled her thumb. Whatever they were, they came out of him in hot geysers, vermiform, fleshy nightmares that gushed over her hands and brought a stench of death, old death and new death, that made her want to weep in her revulsion. Her fingers, seemingly magnetized to the face, continued exploring until they found something like a muscular, phallic, optic stem growing from his forehead. It held a great, swollen, juicy eye that her index finger slid into like an over-ripened plum, soft with rot. And a voice, a gurgling, slopping voice that sounded as if it was spoken through mush, said,
"So thou might see, and thou might make communion with the beautiful, cunning darkness that waits for us all."
When Simone was next aware, she was sitting on the couch. She had no memory of getting there. She was in bed, she had nightmares. Now she was on the couch. Her sense of smell, heightened beyond normal ken, gave her a sampling of the oily, sweaty, fetid odours that seeped from her pores in toxic rivulets. The TV was on. It was on the public access channel. She never listened to public access, but here it was. A man's voice was droning endlessly in great dry detail about the cult of the Magna Mater, Sibyl-worshipping Romans, and the depravity of Phrygian priests. Little of it made much sense. From the dark secrets of alchemy to the thaumatological arts and necromantic rites, from Etruscan fertility cults worshipping the great father of insects to nameless miscegenations that did not walk but crawled within the slime of the honeycombed subterranean passages of Salem.
"Was it not foretold?"
the voice asked.
"Did not Cotton Mather warn of it? Did not his sermons of those cursed of God, born of the tainted blood of those from outside, serve as an omen of worse things to come? Yes, but we did not listen. Was it not known to the mad Arab and his disciples? The time of the shearing and the opening is at hand, is it not? In Al-Azif, thus named for the sounds of night insects, some say, but in truth a cipher that prophesied the coming of Gorgothra, the great father insect. Did he not tell us that Yog-Sothoth was the key, just as the mad, faceless god was the messenger? Yes! Just as he hinted at the blasphemies of the father insect, who was the needle that would open the seams of this world to let the old ones through.
He ranted on about something known as the Pnakotic manuscripts and the angles of Tag Klatur and the Eltdown shards, becoming positively hysterical as he discussed De Vermis Mysterious and the dread Liber Ibonis.
It was all there! All there!
Simone wanted to turn the channel because these public access stations were always infested with half-baked religious fanatics. But she did not. There was something here, something important. The voice told her that in 1913 there appeared a novel by Reginald Pynick called The Ravening of Outer Slith, which quickly disappeared from bookshelves because of its horrendous nature, detailing a fertility cult worshipping a pagan insect deity. It was basically a retelling of the ancient German saga Das Summen, which was hinted at in the grand, grim witch book Unausbringlichen Kulten, and written about in detail by the deranged Austrian nobleman Joseph Graf Regula in his banned tome Cultus Vermis, the very volume which detailed the history of the Gorgothra cult and the coming age of the Old Ones. Regula was convicted of witchcraft and sorcery for writing it, and was drawn and quartered in 1723. No matter. Despite the suppressed knowledge of the cult, fragments of knowledge persisted in Verdun's unspeakable survivals, and in the poem Gathering of the Witch Storm, which was to be found in Azazoth and Other Horrors by Edward Darby.
It was there, prophecy of the ages. Now he comes from the black mist to usurp our world and let the others in. And we, yes, we shall tremble in the shadow of the true progenitors of the dark cosmos that shivers in their wake. The 13th equation is on the lips of the many, and soon comes the communion of locusts. The buzzing, the buzzing, the buzzing.
Simone shut the TV off before she lost what was left of her mind. She was hallucinating. She was paranoid. She was delirious. And listening to the ravings of madmen was not going to help her. Do something. You must do something. The time draws closer. It is now. Frustrated, scared, quivering in her own skin, she called good friends Reese and Carolyn, but they didn't answer. She called friends she hadn't seen in months, Frank and Darian and Seth and Marion. Nothing. No one was answering their phones. Why was no one answering? Because they're gathering now in secret places, on hilltops and misty glens and lonesome fields to wait the coming of. That was insane. Wiping sweat from her face, Simone called her mother. Mum was at the Brighton Coombs Medical Care Facility, a nursing home. Half the time she did not even recognize her daughter's voice, but when she did, she laid out a heavy guilt trip. You shouldn't be living in the city alone. Terrible things can happen in those places. Your father would roll over in his grave if he knew. The line was answered, and 30 seconds later, her mum was on the phone. "Mother, how are you?" Simone said, trying to keep from choking up.
Oh, Simone, my darling, I'm fine. How are you? You sound stressed. Are you eating enough? Do you have a boyfriend yet?
Jesus. I'm okay, just lonely.
Loneliness is a way of life as the years pile up.
But Simone didn't want to get into that. "I'd like to come see you."
Oh, that would be just fine. I wish you were here now. We're all sitting in the sunroom waiting for the big event.
Simone felt a cold chill envelop her. What? What event? Her mother laughed.
Well, the stars will soon align and they will come through. The seas will boil and the sky will crack open. Cthulhu shall rise from the corpse city of Rilia, and Tsothogoa shall descend on the moon ladder from the caverns of NIGH, when the planets roll in the heavens and the stars wink out one by one. Those of true faith will be numbered, and heretics shall be named. You are not an unbeliever, are you, dear?
Sobbing, Simone slammed the phone down. When something furry brushed against her hand, she nearly screamed. But it was only Rocky. It had to be Rocky. Then it moved beneath her hand with the undulating motion of an immense worm. And now she did scream. She launched herself off the couch as that thing moved around her, making a slobbering, hungry sound. She was hallucinating. She had to be hallucinating. Through the furnace ducts, she could hear Josh Ryan saying, "She crawls because she cannot walk. She hears, but she cannot see. The sign. She does not bear the sign." Simone pulled herself up the wall, standing on shaking legs. She heard the scratching again, but this time it was in her own head, like claws and blades and nails scraped along the inside of her skull. Scritch, scratch, scritch, scratch. The apartment was filled with a hot slaughterhouse stench of viscera, cold meat, and buckets of drainage. She could hear the buzzing of flies, what seemed hundreds, if not thousands of them, and the scratching. It was very, very loud now, like giant buzzsaws in the walls, and echoing through her brain. The barrier was coming apart, shifting, tearing, fragmenting, realigning itself. She pressed a hand against the wall and felt a huge, jagged crack open up beneath her fingertips. She touched something that pulsed within it, something busy and squirming like grave worms wriggling in some peristaltic nest. The buzzing was so loud now that she could no longer think. Insects filled the room. They crawled over her arms and up the back of her neck. They tangled in her hair and lighted off her face, sucking the salt from her lips. She stumbled from the living room and into the hallway as that great furry worm searched for her. Things touched her. They might have been hands, but they were puffy and soft with decay. Worming feelers came from the walls and embraced her, squirming over her face to touch her and know her as she had done so many times with so many others. A mammoth rugose trunk brushed her arm, and her fingers slid through a heaving mass of spiky fur. She pulled away, trying to find the wall, and succeeding only in finding a wet pelt hanging there that she knew instinctively belonged to Rocky. Her screams could barely be heard over the constant soaring, scratching noise and something like a great, tolling bell. Sobbing and shuddering, she fell to the floor, and her knees sank into the floorboards as if they were nothing but warm, malleable putty. This was not her apartment. This was the known universe, gutted and turned inside out, merging with another anti-world. She heard the roaring of monstrous locomotive mouths blowing burning clouds of irradiated steam. They shrilled like air raid sirens as the barrier weakened, and the bleeding wound of this world split its seams, and the nuclear blizzard of the void rushed in to fill its spaces. Her fingers touched snaking loops of crystalline flesh, and things like hundreds of desiccated moths and mummified corpse flies rained down over her head. There was a stink like hot neon, shadows falling over her whose touch burned like acid.
The elder sign, child. You must make the elder sign. Revere the sign of Kish.
Yes, she knew it, but did not know it, as the air reverberated around her with a scraping, dusty cackling. Though she could not see, she was granted a vision of the world to come. It filled her brain in waves of charnel imagery that made her scream, made blood run from her nose, and her eyes roll back white in her head. Yes, the world was a tomb, blown by the hissing radioactive secretions of the old ones who walked where man once walked, the skeletons of heretics crunching beneath their stride. The blood of innocents filled the gutters, and putrefied bodies swollen to green carrion decayed to pools of slime. The world was a slag heap, a smouldering pyre of bones, and no stars shone above, only an immense multi-dimensional blackness that would have burned the eyes of men from their sockets if they were to look upon it. Then the vision was gone. But she could still see. The crack in the wall was an immense fissure in the world, splitting open reality as she knew it, and through the gaping chasm, through some freakish curvature of time and space, she saw strobing, polychromatic images of a misty, distorted realm, and some chitinous and truly monstrous form striding in her direction with countless marching legs. Something that was first the size of a truck, then a house, then what seemed a 2-story building. She heard the nightmarish whirring and buzzing of its colossal membranous wings. It looked almost like some grotesque mantis with a jagged, incandescent exoskeleton. It was filling the fissure. Not only filling it, but widening it, its droning mouthparts and needle-like mandibles unstitching the seams of creation. She could hear voices crying. Hysterical and completely demented, she tried to escape it, but one of the insect's vibrating skeletal limbs reached out for her, and she was stuck to it like flypaper. Then it had her, flying off through transgalactic gulfs, through shrieking vortexual holes in the time-space continuum. She was dropped. She fell headlong through a dimensional whirlpooling funnel of matter where slinking geometric shapes hopped and squirmed, and then her sight was stripped of meat. Her soul a sinewy thing, desperate for survival in some godless chaos. She crawled, slinked, crept through the bubbling brown mud and pitted marrow of some new phantasmal unreality. Hungry insectile mouths suckled her, licking sweet drops of red milk, glutting themselves on what she had left. All around her, unseen but felt, were crawling things and throbbing things and sinuous forms mewling with hunger. She crept forward, razored webs snapping, cobweb clusters of meaty eggs dripping their sap upon her. She was trapped in the soft machinery of something alive. Some cyclopean abomination, a gigantic, creeping biological mass born in the night-black pits of some malefic anti-universe. She was crawling over its rotting, fish-smelling, jellied flesh, sliding through its oily pelt, a speck of inanimate dust on some loathsome, unimaginable life form that dwarfed her world and filled the sky with coiling black tendrils that she could not see but could feel crowding her mind and poisoning the blood of the cosmos. She was not alone. Just one of the many colonial parasites that crawled through the mire of the beast's life jelly, swam its brine and foul secretions and oozing sap, her atoms flying apart in a storm of antimatter and energized particles. And then it ended. A rehearsal, perhaps, for what was yet to come. She lay on the living room floor, drooling and gibbering, numb and mindless, giggling in her delirium. She wished only for night to come, when prophecy would be realized and the stars would be right. There was a knob on her forehead, the bud of an optic stem that would let her see the time of the separating and the time of the joining, the rending and the sewing, the communion of this world and the next, as the old ones inherited the earth, and the great father insect left his ethereal mansion of cosmic depravity with a swarm of luminous insects, and took to the skies on membranous wings. As spasms knifed her brain in white-hot shards, the stem pulsated and pushed free, opening like a hothouse orchid so it could show her what was coming. That holiest of nights, when the world of men became a graveyard, and the cities tombs. This episode was brought to you with the generous assistance of our Patreon subscribers. A particular thank you goes out to our esteemed cohorts: Alex Brewers, Robert Troy Hampton Peterson, Sam Bell, Donica Shelley Moody, Michael Wood, and Evan Dooley. We extend a warm welcome to our new Patreon acolyte, Dan West. Welcome aboard, Dan. Until next time, as always, watch the skies, fear the dark, and don't trust anyone, especially yourself. Good night, gentle listener.